ask yourself this. Are you carving up your sales territories based on arbitrary, antiquated systems? Like just drawing lines around zip codes? If you are, well, you're definitely not alone, but you're probably leaving a huge amount of growth on the table. A recent survey actually showed that a staggering 40% of businesses have literally zero internal process for managing their sales territories, and only 10% have a fully automated, data-driven system. Think about that, especially when the average business trip costs something like $2,600. Relying on guesswork and invisible geographic lines isn't just inefficient, it's actively draining your bottom line. Welcome to today's Explainer. I am so pumped to guide you through this because, honestly, we're going to completely rethink how we look at markets. We're taking a really fascinating journey today. We'll start way up high at the macro level of economic theory, and then we're going to zoom all the way down to the street level, literally looking at spatial sales territory optimization. By the time we wrap up, you're going to see exactly why drawing your boundaries based on hard data rather than just basic geography is an absolute game changer for your competitive advantage. Okay, so here's our map for today's Explainer. First, understanding economic clusters. Second, the location quotient explained. Third, mapping industry ecosystems. And finally, smarter sales territories. Let's jump right into part one, understanding economic clusters, looking at the big picture. Let's start our zoom in from the highest possible altitude. If we want to understand where our target accounts actually live and breathe, we really have to look at some incredible research led by the Institute for Strategy and Competitiveness at Harvard Business School. The whole foundation of our journey starts with this brilliant definition by Michael E. Porter. He defines clusters as regional concentrations of economic activities in related industries connected through local linkages and spillovers. So, what does that actually mean for us? It tells us that economic success is not just about a single, isolated company operating in a total vacuum. It's an ecosystem. A cluster is this super dynamic mix of collaboration and competition. You've got manufacturers, suppliers, and service providers all feeding off the exact same local skill pools and shared knowledge. It's a living thing. And think about how a cluster's growth maps out to an S-curve. This stuff doesn't just appear out of nowhere overnight. It's usually triggered by foundational factors, maybe natural resources or a few massive anchor firms. But then it actually undergoes an evolution. Notice that really long, flat period at the beginning? That is the critical mass effect. It takes a long period of foundational growth before the real explosive dynamics kick in. But once it hits that inflection point, boom. Evolutionary forces, like local rivalry and joint investments, literally propel the cluster's strength rapidly upward. For you, understanding exactly where an industry sits on this curve is absolutely vital for targeting your sales efforts. Moving right along to part two, the location quotient explained, or how we measure concentration. So moving down from that high-level macro theory to the state and regional level, we run into a really critical question. How do we actually know if a powerful economic cluster exists right in our own backyard? We obviously can't just guess. We need hard numbers. And that brings us to a fantastic mathematical compass known as the location quotient, or LQ. The Center for Economic and Business Development gives us a really great framework for this. Simply put, the LQ is a statistical measure that assesses industry concentration. It compares the employment share of a specific industry in a local region to the employment share of that exact same industry in a much larger reference area. So think an entire state or even the whole country. The really crucial point here is how we interpret this conversational math. Let's break down the thresholds. If you see an LQ exactly equal to 1.00, that means equilibrium. The region is producing just enough to support its own local demand. If the LQ drops below 0.75, it's considered an importing industry. That means the region just isn't producing enough and actually has to bring goods in from the outside. But here is the magic number for spotting a dense, highly specialized cluster, 1.25. Anything above a 1.25 LQ means it's an exporting industry. They produce a surplus and export it outward to the world. And that right there is your primary indicator of a concentrated, highly lucrative opportunity zone. Let's look at what this actually looks like in reality. Take the 2008 employment figures out of Oklahoma. In the northwest region of the state, magnetic and optical media manufacturing had a location quotient of 12.61. I mean, that is just astronomically high. What that tells us is that a massive, super specialized exporting cluster is hiding in plain sight out there in northwest Oklahoma. Think about it. If you are a supplier for media manufacturing, seeing this single data point completely redefines where you should be deploying your top sales reps, right? All right, part 3, mapping industry ecosystems. Basically how we organize the chaos.
Now that we know how to spot a cluster mathematically, let's zoom in even further to specific B2B ecosystems. We're going to see how we can draw boundaries using NAICS codes. That's the North American Industry Classification System. Let's explore the electrical supplies market, based on analysis by Corp. This market isn't just one giant monolithic block of companies. It's a really complex network. You've got code 335 for the component manufacturers, 423610 for the merchant wholesalers, 238210 for the installation contractors, and 2211 for power generation. By mapping these specific codes together in a geographic region, you start to visualize the entire demand pattern of a supply chain. You literally stop selling to just generic contractors and start targeting the exact right segment of an interconnected ecosystem. It's a total paradigm shift.
And this brings us to a stark contrast in strategy. The old, antiquated way of planning sales territories, it relies on zip codes, completely arbitrary geographic boundaries, and honestly, a whole lot of pure guesswork. It basically assumes that a square mile in one county is perfectly equal to a square mile in another, which we know isn't true. But the modern spatial clustering approach, it relies on real variables. We're talking revenue, profit, employee count, exact location, and those NAICS codes we just talked about. Zip codes simply cannot capture the nuance of where economic clusters actually live, let alone how powerful they are. Which leads us perfectly into part 4, smarter sales territories, optimizing the ground game. Finally, we are zooming all the way down to the street-level strategy. This is where all that high-level cluster theory and location math transforms into actionable, day-to-day plans for a sales rep's route. Consider a real-world scenario from cartomapping Fortune 500 companies in the San Francisco and San Jose region. If you were to just split this territory geographically, it would be a total disaster. Why? Well, because Santa Clara has 2 incredibly high-revenue companies. Fremont has just 2 medium-sized companies. And San Paulo? It holds the crown jewel of literally any portfolio, Apple. Imagine trying to balance this geographically. It would be so blatantly unfair. One rep would be scrambling frantically from massive meeting to massive meeting, completely overwhelmed by Apple and the high-revenue accounts, while the rep over in Fremont would just be twiddling their thumbs. Not all geographic opportunities are created equal, for sure. So how do we actually fix this? Well, by feeding location data, revenue, profit, and employee counts into spatial analysis engines like Carto, businesses can use an algorithm called SCADR. That stands for Spatially Constrained Clustering. What this does is create distinct groups of target accounts that are actually fair and balanced based on their true potential, not just what zip code they happen to be in. You can even use this data to mathematically determine exactly where to place a brand new regional office. For example, let's say your reps are constantly traveling from Chicago over to a cluster of accounts in Detroit. The software can instantly recalibrate the map to show you exactly how a new Detroit hub would redistribute all those surrounding territories for maximum efficiency. It's like a giant puzzle coming together perfectly. And I know what you're thinking. Does this actually work? Absolutely it does. When businesses shed their old geographic boundaries and start navigating by spatial data and economic clusters, they see a staggering 22% increase in sales growth. I mean, wow. That is the direct, measurable ROI of transforming raw data into actionable intelligence. Plus, the impact on the ground for your team is immediate. Reps utilizing these dynamic, clustered territories actually experience a 13% increase in the number of appointments made and a 9% increase in the number of clients visited every single month. Why? Because they aren't driving past hidden opportunities anymore, and they certainly aren't wasting time in dead zones. They are right where the action is. Which leaves us with one final, absolutely critical question. I want you to look at your own maps. Are your territories built on invisible, arbitrary boundaries, or are they built on living, breathing economic data? It is time to stop guessing and start mapping the reality of the market. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer today. Keep questioning those lines on your map and never stop learning.